work for it, ride for it, I'ma organize for it, stay up in the night and in the morning, I'ma rise for it, heart for it, mind for it, ears for it, eyes for it, peace and a place on this earth for me and mine for it, work for it, ride for it, I'ma organize for it, stay up in the night and in the morning, I'ma rise for it, heart for it, mind for it, ears for it, eyes for it, peace and a place on this earth for me and mine for it.
Hey, thanks for tuning in to the Money, Power, Land, Solidarity podcast. I'm really excited and pleased to be joined by a returning guest. Actually, if listeners have checked out our post of a live recording of a night with anti-racist action, Kieran was a part of that panel. Kieran is a active and a veteran organizer, anti-fascist, and recently elected president, CWA Local 17. Is that right?
7250.
7250. I'm tripping out. Yep. I got 17 from Unite Here stuck in my brain. Yeah. So can you say it one more time?
Yeah. I'm president of CWA Local 7250.
Hell yeah. Cool. And Kieran and I wanted to talk tonight and wanted to share this with you, having some reflections on the fascist right. You know, everybody has seen the images of the storming of the Capitol, and I'm sure that's affected people. So we want to talk about that a bit and take a step back and reflect. And then also we wanted to talk about an article that Kieran recently wrote about an influential white supremacist organizer, Tom Metzger, who recently passed, because it's a history that we should know, and it's a history that can offer us some insights into today. So thanks for joining us, Kieran. Welcome.
Hey, I'm pleased to be here. I love this podcast, Jake. I'm excited.
Hell yeah. Thanks, man. That's awesome. To start with, you know, the piece that we're going to talk about in the back half of the show was hosted on a platform called Three-Way Fight. And I think talking about Three-Way Fight, that philosophy, those politics can help really ground us to understand what happened on the 6th of January, the storming of the Capitol. So could you explain to us the politics of Three-Way Fight? What does that refer to?
Yeah, so Three-Way Fight, the idea behind that slogan or that concept is that those of us who are fighting for freedom, for autonomy, for an egalitarian society, are posed not just against the state and capitalism, but also against authoritarian forces that are not coming necessarily from the elite, although they do have relationships with the elite, but have their own sort of genesis and their own sort of motor. And that we need to understand that, the enemy of my enemy isn't necessarily my friend. And so that not only are we against the state and capitalism and the patriarchy, but also against these insurgent authoritarians, particularly the fascists. And so the Three-Way Fight concept and blog is sort of documenting the analysis of people that are coming from that perspective.
Hell yeah. Could you talk a bit, what's the difference between liberal anti-fascism and revolutionary anti-fascism, and why is that nuance important for people to grasp, and how does that relate to that Three-Way Fight, concept?
Yeah, it is important because historically there's been, fascism was a serious threat in the 30s. It achieved state power in a number of countries and organized one of the biggest sort of genocides that has ever took place. And there were different strategies that arose about how to confront it and fight it back then. And there still are those kinds of differences that exist now. And one of the biggest differences was sort of about whether we should try and rally around the present system, the present non-fascist system, in defense of that system against the fascist threat. Despite all its weaknesses, it's still better than fascism, the argument goes. Or whether, in fact, to defeat fascism, we need to also attack the system, because that system has been one of the things that has incubated fascism and that has fed fascism. And so the inequality and the corruption and the exploitation of this system will continue to generate fascist movements unless we take that on as well. Now that comes at people a little bit, it's a little bit scary to take on the fascists, number one, but then to decide that you also have to take on this bigger, powerful system that is the only thing anyone has ever known in our lifetimes is scary to people. And so oftentimes people fall back into supporting the most liberal part of the system because they see that as a better solution or a more realistic solution. But from our point of view, it ultimately doesn't deal with the problem, because as long as the system still exists, as long as the system is still running the world the way it is, there's going to be threats from fascist movements.
Yeah, and it's I just think it's a really important perspective for us now. I think a lot of people were agitated by what happened last week, and Antifa is not a slogan, you know, it's not some scary gang, it's not a mystery, it's the legacy and history of human beings who have come together to protect each other, defend each other, fight against this fascist threat, and to really recognize, you know, there's no neutral liberal democracy that we can just rest back on, fall back on. And I think in our context in the United States, it's been comfortable, especially for white people, for privileged people for a while, and we've been fed that message that that's not going to be an option, that the liberal democracy is what's driving this fascist threat. And it's deep because, you know, the philosophy of liberalism, of private property, it comes from the same root system as fascism. They're not that far away from one another. So to bring this three-way fight perspective to the table, that we are fighting the system, we're also fighting the fascist right, which, just to reflect on something else that you said, I think it's important because it shows the state and the liberal capitalism for what it is, something that's violent and related to fascism. And it also shows that fascist movements in the working class are not our friends, or they're not automatically good because it might look like working class people out there, that it doesn't automatically mean that we're going to move to something more just from capitalism. There's authoritarian forces that would like to oppress us more deeply than we're being oppressed now. And that's what yeah, I guess that's the purpose for today too, to affirm, is that I want to talk this stuff out, you know, because just like everybody listening, I was nervous and afraid seeing that shit on the TV and fucked up. So it's like, it's helpful to speak it out.
Yeah, no, I agree. There's a lot of moving pieces, but I think I'll just riff on a couple of the things that you said, Jake. I think the first one is that the people that have always stood up against the fascists first primarily have been, one, the people that have been targeted by the fascists. So, you know, religious, racial minorities, and oppressed people, but also the radicals that were trying to take on the system.
Absolutely.
Were also the people that stood up against the fascists. And I think there's been this whole sort of meme developed of Antifa as this sort of like mysterious other thing. But really what it is, you know, regular people organizing themselves to take on a threat.
Yeah.
And just in our city, I think it's important for people to know that in 1938, the first sort of Antifa, if you will, in Minneapolis was actually the Union Defense Guard, which was organized by the Teamsters who had done the big strike in 1934. And one of those strike leaders, a Native American guy called Ray Rainbolt, was the chair of the Union Defense Guard. And the Union Defense Guard was created because the Silver Shirts had been brought to Minneapolis by some racists and by some of the big bosses in town, because they wanted to not only attack the Jewish community and attack the Black community, but also attack the militant unions. And so Ray Rainbolt and the Union Defense Guard organized themselves, trained union members, and marched on the Silver Shirts and chased them out. Basically did such a show of force that the Silver Shirts were never able to establish themselves here. So that was sort of the first so-called Antifa in Minneapolis. And then you've done a lot of work in helping promote the history of anti-racist action, which was, you know, something created by teenagers from Minneapolis to take on the Nazis in Uptown in the 80s.
Yeah.
And so it's not these mysterious, shadowy, you know, terrorists or something. It's regular people from our city who've given a lot of their lives to take on, you know, this fascist threat. And then I think another point you were trying to make about sort of the liberal establishment, and I think how to view it in terms of it's when the fascists are attacking the liberal establishment. I think there's been a lot of discussion about what our response should be. What should working class radicals' response be to that? And I think one thing we shouldn't do is rally around the institution, right?
Right.
My problem with what happened on January 6th wasn't that the Capitol got attacked, or that that some senators had to go hide, or some offices got vandalized. My worry was that the fascists are in motion and that they're taking bold action,
Yes.
and that their vision of the world, of this country, is one in which, people are even more oppressed and more exploited and more victimized than they are under this system. And so seeing them take a bold action is like seeing you know, your enemy flex.
Right.
And even if they're not flexing at you at that moment, it's not a good thing for them to get in that in motion. And I think it did also show, I think, overall about how our system, our society, this system is weak. And I think those of us that lived in Minneapolis during the uprising, we saw, maybe we're a little bit surprised even about how weak this system was. But I think this is another sign of that.
Yes.
And it's all the more reason for those of us that want, an anti-authoritarian, egalitarian, free society to organize ourselves, and not, no one's coming to save us. It's up to us to do it.
I think that's a great point. And that's what I want people to, who are listening to this, who might think like it's very important that we impeach Donald Trump. And I'm all for it. Impeach him. Go get him. But what I don't want you to do is to develop a false sense of security or to defer your responsibility, our collective responsibility. And that's what's important, is that it's not hyperbole or sounding chic. History tells us, and our lives tell us, that the state isn't interested in protecting us, and they'll collaborate, especially in the United States. This white nationalist element is so embedded that we have to. And what's affirming, though, and why I'm glad to hear that history, is because we can and we will. It becomes such a spectacle. And I think that's a way that kind of the state and the fascist elements work together, is to scare us into submission. I don't think it's a coincidence, that the fascist right and our enemies were flexing after a summer when we showed that we could take down the system, that we could challenge the system. These things are related to one another. They're trying to get us to cower, be quiet, so, and that's why, let's just jump into then. What are your thoughts from last week? As somebody who studies and somebody who analyzes, could you share, what are your main takeaways from the storming of the Capitol?
Yeah, I've been trying to think about it, and just like everyone, I was paying attention to it. It was a trip to watch, but I think the main thing is that it was a flex. It was an impressive flex. And I say that as somebody who considers them my life and death enemy.
Yeah.
But they pulled off. They stormed the Capitol.
Right.
And they caught the attention of the entire world by doing that, and they scared the hell out of the political class. And all of that is to say that it was a major action, and that I think that the people that participated in it on their side, and the people who watched it vicariously, supporters that weren't there but who watched it and were encouraged by it, that they feel emboldened. They feel like they can make history. They feel like they're on the march, that they have momentum. And I think that that's pretty important, because up to now, that movement had been very much the creature of Donald Trump, right? He'd been this sort of like king, godlike figure for them. And that really retarded their ability to sort of become a full-fledged movement on its own, right? Because Donald Trump also has all these profit motives, and he's got these sort of narrow interests that are very much around his own wealth and his own power. And I think this was showing us what we are going to have to be dealing with in the next few years, is a fascist movement that's exerting its own autonomy from Donald Trump and from that whole Republican Party. Right. And that's going to actually make it more dangerous on the street, I believe. They won't be so tied into elections and into politicians, but to trying to assert power where they can. And that started to even happen a little bit on the streets of St. Paul the last few weeks, where there's been sort of like competing rallies between anti-fascists and the far right. Sort of the far right came out in the streets around against the lockdown, the COVID restrictions in the state, and also, in support of the police and in support of Donald Trump, and against Biden winning the election. And in response, militant anti-fascists have organized themselves. And so far, the police have mainly kept them separate. There were a few scuffles, but it is basically, starting to be some competition over the streets in St. Paul. Yeah. And I think we're going to see more of that going forward.
So with that, some of the field of play sketched out in that way, how should we respond? You know, and I'm curious both from like, you know, just generally, what are you thinking? And then also for somebody who might be agitated now and looking to like step up and participate in keeping folks safe, like, what do you think strategically are our opportunities right now? And how do you think we should orient ourselves towards combating their momentum?
I mean, the first thing is always be critical minded, trying to analyze what's going on in the paper, in the community, in the country, in the world, you know, with a critical viewpoint. So you're not just absorbing something that one of the power blocks in society is selling, or some propaganda. You know, try and be critical minded about it, try and analyze what's going on. And then I think the other thing is to really organize, you know, to organize yourself with, you know, your friends, your family, your coworkers, your neighbors, and really do it in the sense of, you know, mutual aid, common self-defense, and have a perspective not only of defending your own little circle, but the entire, you know, working class. At least that's how I approach it. So I think there's a need to start getting organized and to make those organizations count. So I think one of the things we have to look at, and you've probably heard a phrase or a quote that's been used a lot, from Germany in the 30s, where Hitler supposedly said that the only chance, you know, for us to have been beaten is if we would have been crushed at the very beginning.
Yeah.
So I think there's going to be a need for us to try and, you know, inhibit their organizing. If we allow them to organize freely, they're going to do more things like what happened on the 6th. They're going to be more ambitious. They're going to take more space in society, and then trying to start implementing their idea of what their society looks like in any place that they can. So I think that we're going to have to be willing to try and contest that. And it's different than in the 30s or even in the 80s, because now everybody's armed. You know, right. They're armed every time. You can't just sort of bum rush them because they have guns. So that means that we have to be smart and strategic. And I think it also really underscores the need for us to develop our own mass base, which is kind of maybe a leftist type of term, but what it means is that we build popular support for the kinds of organizing we're doing. Not only popular support, but the involvement of regular, everyday working class people, so that the organizations that we're building are reflective of the community and are rooted in the community. And so that when the fascists attack one of us, they see it not only as an activist being attacked, but one of our sisters or brothers, right, and respond in that way. And that's one of my sort of fears in terms of what could go wrong with anti-fascist organizing, is if we just sort of like go into a little cul-de-sac of our own little bubble, our own little militancy, but we're not sharing that militancy or explaining that militancy with the broader class and community. Yeah. It could be very easily to isolate us. And we have to remember that the system sees militant anti-fascists as an enemy, just like they see, you know, these right-wingers storming the Capitol. I think during the campaign, Biden, you know, at one point, he's been contradictory, but at one point he indicated that Antifa needed to be suppressed. We know that Trump, you know, sees Antifa as a terrorist threat and wants to smash it and wants to put the state on it. So, and we know from our own experiences that local police departments regularly harass and arrest and repress anti-fascists. So in order not to be sort of isolated and easy pickings, we need to develop our own mass base.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, I there's some of the reflections I've been having over the last week have been really intimate and really like, one, taking the time in my own heart. You know, I've considered myself, I've tried to put effort into being an anti-fascist and an anti-racist. You know, these questions have been in my face since a kid. But going back and affirming in myself and facing even the fear that I feel, you know, or the nervousness and the anxiety, but then making a strong intention in my heart and speaking the words just to say, every human being deserves freedom and life. Racism is wrong. Fascism is wrong. I will not cower to these people. We will not be bullied by these people. There's people who came before me who stood up to them. And even then, on a text loop today, you know, some of my in-laws talking about, man, I hope they prosecute Trump. And just to realize, rather than to do less is to just do a little more and say, yes, you know, I hope they do, but we have to confront fascism everywhere we are in our lives. And they don't even necessarily hear those words, but that's something that they want to be a part of. And
for sure.
And so it's like, what I really appreciate is like the clear, sober analysis. We can't wish these problems away. We're going to have to out-organize them. And I think to balance that, you know, the analysis and to analyze the threat is to affirm in us our will to fight, our love for one another, our strength. You know, we did a lot of strong organizing, and we do have mass popular support. So
yeah,
I guess that's my role today, is just offering more some of those like affirmations, you know?
And I did a little funny kind of a joke post because it was after the whole, you know, the 6th, and everyone's tripping on what happened and trying to absorb it and trying to think about the lessons. But, you know, one thing I said was, you know, the George Floyd uprising would have whooped the MAGA riots ass. And I really think that's true, you know, because they talk about what happened in DC as being an insurrection. And to me, that's actually a slur on the word insurrection, which is
swear
it's a great word, right? It means an uprising, you know, of a revolutionary uprising. And Minneapolis was way more that, the characteristics of that in terms of regular, everyday, poor people rising up and really challenging the system on so many fronts. You know, not just storming the doors of power of one, you know, where the politicians were, but challenging the power all across the region, and so many people being involved in it, you know, across different communities. And so I feel like you're right that we have a lot to build on, but we can't sleep on it either, because I think one thing that you know, history's shown us is that in the 30s in Germany, there was actually a very well organized working class. In fact, it was the most unionized and had one of the largest leftist movements in all of Europe. And they basically were defeated by the fascists without a fight, you know? And there's a whole lot of reasons why that happened, a whole lot of political maneuvers and bobbing and weaving that happened. Right. But we have to be aware that there's those kinds of dangers. And then to circle back to what you're saying about your in-laws or about the system, I mean, I think it would be great and easy for everyone if the system would just take care of this problem, right? But we know that that's not what happens. You know, historically, the system is not interested in solving this problem. And I think that we have to understand that, like, Biden, although, you know, I think all of us were happy to see Trump to be defeated. You know, he's such a racist, vile, sexist, you know, scumbag. But when we talk about Biden, you know, 3 of the biggest disasters inflicted on working class people in my lifetime, you know, the mass incarceration and the war on drugs, number 1. Yeah. NAFTA, which moved jobs out of this country and opened up, you know, competition between forcing Mexican workers and American workers into competition with each other. And, you know, had the effect of ripping up the Rust Belt in the Midwest in particular. And then the third thing is the Iraq War, which was a total disaster for working class people in the Middle East and here, with, you know, billions of dollars, trillions of dollars spent, you know, hundreds of thousands of people killed in Iraq, tens of thousands of American soldiers killed. You know, Biden was a major supporter of all 3 of those things. So if people are putting their hopes on a person like that, you really have to go back and ask, how bad has it gotten? That this is what we're hoping is going to represent something positive, because his record is one of attack and attack and attack. And you know, we obviously have to have nuanced conversations with people about that. And the main point isn't to like rub someone's face in it if they voted for Biden, because I understand why people would, you know, against Trump. But I think the main thing is that we can't have any faith or reliance on a system that's coming from a place like that.
Absolutely. I think it really, you said something that was really key, I think, in terms of it would be great if we could, if the good troops would come in, swoop in, and democracy would be saved. And that's a really alluring myth to hide inside of, you know. But I think now is the time for everybody to really confront that reality that it's not going to be somebody from the outside, that we all have to play our part in keeping each other safe, and that's possible. And that means, yeah, it's not about like shaming somebody for Biden, but helping your loved ones make that shift in their own lives into like, no, I have to take responsibility for this. And I wanted to say, you know, some of the options for linking up with some of this work. It doesn't mean, I'm not going to say what it doesn't mean. What it can mean is joining a union. You know what I'm saying? Or getting more involved with your union at work, or trying to connect with your coworkers if you're not in a unionized, you know, for me, I'm realizing I live in an apartment building, talking to my neighbors, organizing my neighbors, you know, getting involved in the neighborhood organizations that are there, and having these battles on the front line and stoking the forces of equity. You know, there is also, if you want to learn how to shoot a gun, link up with like-minded people and learn how to shoot a gun. That's your right. That's good. You know, you're gonna, all these things that are like that are going to make our lives richer regardless also help us fight fascism by connecting with one another. Because a lot of times, you know, I think people are watching all this shit on screens and it's paralyzing, you know, and that's a part of this is you'll feel better if you get in motion, you know?
Right. I agree with that 100%. And I think also, you know, I think the best argument is an example, right?
Absolutely.
You can have arguments all day long where you're just sort of on paper or on a screen. But if you can show an example of what you're talking about, that's such an effective argument. It's the hardest thing to do, to build an example. But as much as we can do it, then we're going to win arguments, and we're going to start bringing people around to stuff. People want to have control over their lives, you know,
Absolutely.
No matter who they voted for or whatever, they want to have control over their lives. So if the organizations and the movements we're building are ones in which people actually have power and are not just being manipulated, then I think that's going to be an attractive pole against the system and the fascists.
I think that's a good segue too into talking about the piece that you wrote. One, I just wanted to say before we talk about it, folks can find this piece at threewayfight.blogspot.com, and I'll link to it in the show notes. It's weird to say I enjoyed it because it's such an ugly history that you're detailing, but I really appreciated reading this piece. Like I had a vague idea of who this man was, but didn't really know the history. And it was really useful for me in this time. So I just wanted to big you up for writing it, and then ask if you can tell us, who was Tom Metzger and why were you moved to write this piece, you know, to mark his transition to hell?
Yeah, his ticket to hell.
His descent.
Yeah, Metzger was, in many ways, as a teenager, I was an anti-fascist skinhead. I was in the Minneapolis Baldies, hanging out with friends, and building an anti-racist movement, a youth movement. And Metzger hung over us in a sense because he was this almost like a villain. He was the main sort of adult, grown-up supporter of our enemies, the Nazi skinheads. And Metzger was a supporter of them because he understood the power of insurgent youth, whereas some of the older Nazi types were actually scared of Nazi skinheads when they came around. Because Nazi skinheads weren't an invention by some political party. They were kind of an expression, a cultural expression that popped up spontaneously. And a lot of the far right and the conservatives and the fascists, you know, thought they were all just drug addicts and violent and undisciplined. And Metzger thought that it was great, you know, that here was some insurgent, racist white youth who were going to shake things up. And so he supported them. And since we were fighting them, we saw him as sort of a godfather villain type person. And he actually, because we were also sort of a threat to his project, because we represented a multiracial, anti-racist alternative, he put out death threats against some of us, you know, and so, you know, when you're 18 years old or something and somebody in California is putting out a hit on you, you know, it sort of sticks with you.
Yeah.
And yeah.
I wish this is all audio, but it's like, that's a nice smirk you got right there.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And so we had a special kind of hatred for him, and also in a weird way, a certain kind of respect in the sense that he was not a bumbling fool. he wasn't just some stupid redneck. He was
Yeah.
a strategist. He was a strategist for the enemy side. And so we tried to follow what he was doing, pay attention to it, because he was serious. He was a serious problem.
Yeah. And that's again, I feel like that's a lesson for us to learn as far as just that mentality, as far as like you don't make yourself safer by ignoring your enemies. You make yourself safer by out preparing, out studying, out organizing your enemies. So just that orientation is inspiring. Could you talk a bit about Metzger's journey? Because I think it kind of gives people a window into the roots of what we're seeing in front of us today. What were the different political organizations that he attached himself to kind of build his power base?
Yeah, so coming out of the army in the early '60s, he got hooked up with the John Birch Society, which, if you look that up, they were a very influential group in the '50s and '60s that basically united a lot of far-right anti-communists, and their main sort of theme was anti-communism. But many of their members started drifting over further right into anti-Semitic and neo-Nazi types of activity, and Metzger was one of those types of people. He went from the John Birch Society into the Ku Klux Klan. And this was David Duke's Ku Klux Klan. David Duke was another sort of important strategist for the Nazis. And Duke was trying to basically bring the Klan into the modern era, bring it into the 20th century, not be just seen as rednecks in hoods, but as a sort of modern fascist movement. He also really did a lot of, he was influenced by Nazi politics too. The Klan and the Nazis actually have a sort of separate history. And he was somebody who sort of joined them together, brought a lot of Nazi politics into the Klan, but also tried to modernize them both. Anyways, Metzger was his guy in California. And so he was organizing Duke's Klan in California. And from there, Metzger started to sort of develop his own kind of politics, even beyond where Duke was at, where he was seeing a white power movement that was not going to just be conservative or far right, but was going to be a revolutionary movement, one that based itself in the white working class and sought to overthrow the society, capitalism. And so he started like borrowing and ripping off left-wing concepts, but putting them into racist terms, into white power terms. And so he started, the organization that he founded after he left the Klan was called White Aryan Resistance, or WAR. And he put out a newspaper called WAR that had a bunch of political articles, but also a lot of racist cartoons, and was really aimed at the young Nazi skinhead youth in the United States, of which there were all of a sudden hundreds of them.
What years was that?
So this would have been the mid '80s. Mm-hmm. Going forward is when he started WAR. And he was, like I said before, he was the first real of the Nazi adult organizers, that recognized them as that recognized the Nazi skinheads as an asset to their movement, as opposed to a liability. And he geared his whole organizing towards trying to unite with this youth movement. And so he also really, because this is all before the internet now, it's a whole other world, and he was real adept at getting on TV and getting in mass media and doing it and keeping his message. He didn't water down his message. One of his criticisms of Duke was he thought Duke was watering down their message in order to mainstream it. And Metzger found ways to get on, not like the news programs like 60 Minutes, but to get on talk shows like Oprah Winfrey's talk show and Geraldo Rivera's talk show, and to basically just get on their shows and talk shit,
Yeah.
And to be real blunt and to really frame himself as a defender of regular poor and working class white people. And basically he put out there, there's no one one of his messages was, there's nobody in society who's defending poor and working class white people. We know that the rich have lots of things that defend them, and he would argue that the Black community has Black organizations that defend them, and Latino community has Latino organizations that defend them, but there's nobody protecting, the white people at the bottom, which isn't accurate anyways, but it was sort of a powerful argument that he made. And it was one that the talk show hosts were not equipped to take on, So he would often, in many ways, win those arguments on the TV, and then sometimes they'd physically win them too. Like they on the Geraldo show, a brawl broke out, and Geraldo got his face smashed by one of the war supporters. So they walked out of that with a lot of swagger, you know, and in an era where before internet, it's hard to describe that era for people that weren't in it, but in that era, you didn't have immediate access to news and images, so anytime one would pop up in your world, whether it be somebody, one of your friends had a magazine with an article about something that you were interested in, or something was coming on TV that was of your interest, it became a major focus, and it was a real breakthrough. And Metzger was very good at using the media to put his message out there.
So that strategy, where Metzger distinguished himself from other forces on the right wing, I like in your article you point to, that was the time of Ronald Reagan, you know what I'm saying? And the conservative movement was buttoned up, and they had these underground links, but the way they presented themselves was more conservative. And Metzger was advocating this, revolutionary fascism. And I think it's important then to point out how those different orientations show up. That's what we saw on the 6th, in terms of, rather than running for election, they're going to co-opt insurrectionary tactics, take direct action. That's a different type of threat. And Metzger, it seemed like, seeded a lot of that. Like a lot of what we're seeing today is pulling from his playbook. One thing that you point to then, so you use Metzger then to illuminate the legacy of those politics deeper, because that has some foundation. So could you talk about Strasserism? Like, how was Metzger an American Strasserist, Strasserite, whatever? And who were the Strasser brothers? Why is that type of politics such a threat?
Right on. Yeah. So Metzger's politics, that sort of revolutionary white supremacist politic that he was trying to represent, he wasn't the first one. And when students of fascism often look at the Nazis as one of their prototypes, because obviously it was such a prototype for fascism. And within the Nazi movement, I think most of us really just know about Hitler, and maybe we've heard of one or two other Nazi leaders. But most of us just know about Hitler, and we don't know about the dynamics that happened within the Nazi party. But the Nazis were a mass movement in Germany, mostly made up of World War I veterans, many of whom were unemployed because there was a Great Depression between the wars. And
could I ask a question real quick? My bad.
Yeah.
That's a dynamic that was present in Italy too. And my understanding is that post-war veterans and this idea of like imperialism coming home is like somehow central to fascist development. Is that fair to say?
I think that people make a convincing argument to me in that, that part of Germany had been a powerful European country, as had Italy, and in a situation where they're getting sort of left behind by the other big European colonial powers in terms of the looting of the rest of the world, their imperialism, if you will, gets directed inward, and so that the first thing that the fascists have to do before they can conquer the world is conquer their own country, and not only that, but then also do savage attacks, against the Jewish community in Germany in particular, in order not only to sort of villainize somebody and have a scapegoat to organize the rest of society around, but also just to loot that community and to take whatever wealth was in there and use that to build up their state and to enrich themselves, and then also to turn those people into slaves.
Yeah.
And so it was kind of this sort of internal colonialism in a sense.
I keep thinking about this dynamic between the KKK and the Nazis, and I think about it's important the way, like, it's important to call the right wing in the United States Nazis and to label them in that way because they do come from that tradition. But the Nazis learned from Americans, and to think about how could you, like, the chattel slavery system was some kind of fascism, it's like important for us to understand the legacy here. And I was thinking about that when you were talking about Metzger, because he was organizing the Nazi movement while a part of the KKK, and that economic foundation for fascism in terms of a small number of people controlling the land, controlling the productive forces, hyper exploiting the labor of everybody else. These are the dynamics, that looting dynamic. When I think about Reconstruction, right, there was a moment where the South could have took a different direction towards some kind of multiracial democracy or socialist project, and the KKK and that racist violence was a part of expropriating the land. Yes. So, yeah. All right. So back to who are the Strasser brothers? These internal dynamics in the Nazi Party.
Yeah. So within the Nazi Party, there were different factions, and there were two brothers named Strasser who ended up representing a sort of different wing of politics within the Nazi Party. And one of them in particular had a much more, was much more committed to overthrowing and expropriating the German ruling class. Basically, the rich and the powerful in Germany are traitors to us and exploiters who've been exploiting the good, Aryan German working class. And so we're going to overthrow them, not to create an egalitarian society, but in order to install a new elite. But in their thinking, they still needed to overthrow this German ruling class, and they pushed that much harder. And this was at a time when Hitler was basically making a deal with the German ruling class in order to maintain his power, that he would put some of the parts of the Nazi movement that scared the German ruling class the most, that Hitler would put them in check. In particular, the SA, or the brown shirts, which were kind of the masked thugs of the Nazi Party, the ones that did Kristallnacht, which was the pogrom against the Jewish community, where they smashed out the windows of Jewish businesses all over Germany and beat up Jewish people on the street and killed people. But they also were sort of seen as undisciplined and a threat to sort of law and order in Germany. Mm-hmm. And also the leader of the brown shirts was somebody that also echoed the things the Strassers were saying in terms of wanting to overthrow, that they saw the Nazis as sort of revolutionary project against the German ruling class. So for students of fascism, the term Strasserite, named after the Strasser brothers, has become a sort of shorthand for the kind of fascists that are not just interested in sort of a dictatorship under business as usual capitalism, but a sort of revolutionary overthrow of that capitalism and an installation of a fascist dictatorship against the old order.
Right.
And Metzger vibed with that 100%.
And it's a dangerous politics when you have the conditions that we live in the United States. It seems like to me, when you have people who are deeply alienated, people who are poor, people who are disenfranchised, and a soil where racism is very present, and you have scapegoats. And that's why I think it's important for you to highlight it, or just, I think about what I know of you and me is like being white working class people, being around poverty and struggle and feeling animosity and anger towards the system, is recognizing that not to let people off the hook, but that's the type of fuel that fascists take advantage of. So as anti-fascists, it's important for us to identify that tendency and call it for the lie that it is, that there's nothing revolutionary about racist class politics, that they don't fit together. So can you talk a little bit more about your critique of Strasserism and like, how do we counter that threat?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think ultimately the big thing about Strasserism and the Nazism was that it did not ultimately help regular German working class people, right? In fact, it brought the worst war the world had ever seen, and brought death and destruction to regular people all across Europe. So while some German families might have gotten high on the kind of pageantry that Hitler was putting on and made themselves feel superior to Jews, and maybe if you were up in the Nazi hierarchy somewhere, you got some wealth out of it. But for most people, there was no real gain from being part of the Nazi or having the Nazis rule. In fact, it was the opposite of a gain. It was destruction of everything in their lives. You know, millions of people's lives ruined. And so I think that what Metzger was selling was still race war. You know, even though he supposedly was wanting to overthrow the system and didn't have any love for the white capitalists up above us, his main thrust of this was still that white working class people had to be ready to fight and attack and go to war with the Black community, Latinos, gay and lesbian community, and Jewish people. And so this was a common, you know, this was stressed again and again and again. And I think that we have to say, even if you have no kind of political perspective in terms of wanting, you know, some kind of freer, more egalitarian society, still that is still a message, a path of destruction and you know, heartbreak and death and bloodshed. And so I think that one of our messages has to be is that these fascists, you know, are going to bring, you know, they want the downfall of us all, but that's what their project is going to bring about. And I think people can kind of see that. And that's sort of the reason why so many people have reservations about them, you know, or hate them, is because they can see that that's what they stand for. And sometimes it gets summed up sort of simply or kind of in a liberal way about them being hate filled. But there's some part of it that's kind of true too, you know, that they're really motivated by hate in a way that isn't about hating your oppressor, but about, you know, hating other human beings. And Metzger was still, so even though he was breaking from the fascist and all, or the conservative, you know, Klan and, you know, these many ways, he was still very much, you know, centered in this virulent white supremacist, patriarchal, you know, violent hatred. And I think that is, you know, we can't make any compromise with that. Like, we can't make any alliance with that. We can't share the barricades with something like that, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's really important because it's people trying to employ those tactics now and to draw that sharp contrast. And like you said, it's a contrast in every way. It's in political vision, economic vision, just orientation to ourselves and each other, it needs to be stomped out. I like the way you kind of framed the closing is, you know, third position politics, which would be this Strasserite fascism versus three-way fight, you know, because the reality is that the system is not sustainable, and there's going to be purchase for that type of co-optation of anger if we're not out organizing those people and offering alternative solutions, a liberatory society. You know, we're really pointing to who is the real enemy and what can we do to build something for ourselves.
Yeah, to maybe be a little controversial, I think, like, within our movements, sometimes you know, you'll run into arguments that basically, like, white supremacy is good for white working class people. And I think that, like, there's a piece of that there's true. There's, like, certain privileges that come to regular white working class people, even poor working class white people, from white supremacy. But overall, white supremacy is a trap for working class white people. And if we make the argument that white supremacy is good for white people, then I think we're advertising white supremacy to white people, you know? Yeah. And I think that our argument should be that actually white supremacy is a trap for white people, and that we need to break from that trap. And that means rejecting white supremacy, because it's killing working class people. It's holding people down, including white people. And that it's very important that there be a multiracial fight against white supremacy.
Certainly. Even as far as, like, I really agree with you. And to be able to not just affirm, it's important to help people understand the way that white supremacy, the privileges it gives us, tempts us to collude with it or puts us on a default path of collusion, is to say, like, whiteness itself, like, what is that? You're not white. You know, that's something that's been sold to you. That's a lie. It's a perversion of reality. And the whole idea that you're getting sold a ticket by somebody that you have nothing in common with. You have way more in common with the people around you, the multiracial working class. We're a part of that. And we have to address those questions head on. I agree. And it can be sticky to talk about, but it's important that we speak on it.
Yeah, totally. No, I agree with you. Like, yeah, whiteness is a lie, you know, it's a made up lie. And I think that it's important to fight it, to expose it, and to do it in a way that, like everything we do, we got to be bold, but we also got to be patient, and we have to
Certainly.
build with people, and build up our credibility with people by showing, how we act in the world. But we also have to tell the truth, and we also have to, be real clear with people about what we think about things.
Yeah, I might be abusing the term dialectics, but I think about, reflecting on whiteness and my own identity, and being a white American, and also being a proud member of the Irish diaspora, and all of these things is like, you have to acknowledge that, like, we've all been socialized in this society, and whiteness and white privilege are real things that we have to unlearn and work through. And also, the whole system of racial categorization, the whole idea of whiteness is a lie. We're full human beings. We have a right to self-determine, and there's a horizon past American whiteness, and I think this revolution that we're fighting is a part of that. We have to confront these questions. We have to redistribute wealth and power and deal with the legacy of slavery. And I feel like, we can move towards something better. All right, shut it down, Jake.
I'm with you. I think we need to be giving each other more speeches like that.
Yeah, hell yeah,
I do. Mm-hmm.
Well, man, thank you for writing this article, sharing the history, and for talking through it with us. I feel like for me, it gives me confidence. It helps me move through the anxiety, and gives me fuel and ideas for moving forward. So I really appreciate you joining us.
No problem.
Any last thoughts for our listeners? Anything going on in the soccer world of note?
Always stuff going on. My son will probably tell us better. No, I think I do want to say that I'm hopeful. I think that there's a lot of people who have gained a lot of experience this last year, and who are getting more sophisticated in how they look at the world and look at politics. And I think there's people experimenting with a lot of different kinds of self-organization.
Hell yeah.
And all of that is important and is going to mean something.
Absolutely. I just wanted to say one last thing is connected to the whole whiteness thing is, if you were out there fucking getting all worked up fighting for Donald Trump, a billionaire piece of shit, telling you an obvious lie, you look like a fucking idiot, and you don't have to look like that, And there was a lot of people who stood up and can see clearly that the murder of George Floyd and the poverty we're forced to live in is wrong. Fight for that side. You know what I'm saying? You look like a fucking asshole out there fighting for Donald Trump.
Totally. 100%.
Yeah. All right, man. Hey, stay up, man. Love to the family. We'll talk to you soon.
Take care, Jake.
Peace.
We need money.